War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 21, Time and Tempo. There is, within the military mindset, a bias towards action. For the Navy and Air Force, it's a bias of necessity. A ship not moving is a target and a waste of a power plant. For a plane, it's a smoldering wreck. As the Navy and Air Force are defined by ships and planes, they are almost inexorably connected to movement. Boyd's OODA loop required action. While doing nothing may be seen as a deliberate choice, action, by etymology, requires an act. This bias is historic, in fact, prehistoric. Men are not famous for multitasking, and a man under arms is not capable of doing anything else. They are massed, away from homes and farms. For 99% of human existence, the day-to-day of humans' existence consisted of sustaining themselves, their families, and their immediate community. And when the time came to war, everything else came to a halt. For whomever had the stronger army, usually defined by the larger army, had the inherent advantage. Should you try an economy of force at the strategic level, you risk defeat, thus nullifying any temporary advantage gained by attempting to minimize the disruption to the non-martial aspects of life. This episode will be full of bon mots and aphorisms, and so we'll start with the most basic in all of fighting. When it's time to fight, fight like you're the third monkey at Noah's Ark, and brother, it's starting to rain. This applies to one-on-one combat, as well as alliances of nation-states at war. The idea of time is self-evident, and without getting too metaphysical or mystical, it is fixed, available to each combatant in equal doses. And the nature of time in combat means time benefits one side more than the other. It is never neutral. This bias of action will benefit one side more than the other. Of course, once one side acts, returning to Boyd, the conditions have changed, and, like a timer used in chess, the advantage of time can rapidly, almost instantaneously, swing from one side or the other. The smaller the scale of combat, the more quickly these conditions can change. How quickly you act within the fixed concept of time is usually referred to as tempo. Any action taken changes the conditions and the nature of time. The faster the tempo of action, the more disruptive its effect on the opponent. Again to Boyd, getting inside your enemy's loop. As attributed to Patton, a general known for his audacious maneuver and demand of action, a good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan next week. However, this bias for action can cause leaders to undermine or abandon an advantageous position. Focusing on the tactical level and returning to the basics of ground combat, the defense has an inherent advantage. The longer decisive combat is delayed, the more time the defender has to shape the battlefield and prepare defensive positions. However, as you progress to the operational level, the logistics of massing forces may make delaying the offensive worth facing the improved defense. This was one of the arguments for delaying Overlord. Even in combat, patience can be a virtue. Tactical and strategic patience are a thing. One of the hardest adjustments as a combat commander is to recognize when the bias to action offensive spirit begins to work against you. Early in my career, I was the operations officer, S3, for a maneuver battalion during a computer exercise where my unit was on the offensive. The plan was going well. We had broken the main line of defense and were executing the pursuit against a broken enemy. And then my lead company was wiped out in about 1 minute. Not wanting to lose the opportunity of destroying the enemy, the reserve company was quickly thrust into the pursuit, and they too were wiped out. While we had taken the objective, 90% of our losses occurred in the pursuit. An anti-tank unit had set up a hasty defense behind the main line of defense. Had I paused to acquire the situation, no more than 10 minutes, I could have used artillery, having already won the artillery duel, to suppress or destroy the unarmored anti-tank units. My bias for action and demand for a high tempo, ingrained since West Point, was used against me by the instructors who wanted to prove a point. And prove it they did. Fortunately, the loss was only electronic and not flesh and blood. The great Napoleon saw this dynamic when he stated, "Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake." His masterful victory at Austerlitz was primarily due to his ability to predict the enemy's aggressiveness and use it against them with a series of feigned retreats. The Allies there suffered from a lack of unity of command, with the Russian Field Marshal Kutuzov, nominally the commander of the joint Austrian and Russian forces, suggesting prudence, patience, and a withdrawal to establish their own defenses deeper in the Carpathian Mountains. But Tsar Alexander overruled his commander and ordered enactment of the aggressive plan from the Austrian Chief of Staff, Franz von Weyrother. This course of action was predicted by Napoleon, and his entire plan for the battle rested upon this assumption. Strategically, Napoleon's army was far from its logistical base and could not withstand a long period of inactive defense. Kutuzov knew this and wished to take advantage of it. But the demand for action overruled. Even during the battle, when Kutuzov seized the geographically critical Pratzen Heights, which, despite its relatively low altitude, dominated the battlefield, Kutuzov wished to pause and consolidate a defense. But, again, Tsar Alexander overruled his commander and placed Weyrother in overall command, who quickly abandoned the heights and continued the advance into an awaiting ambush. There's far more to Austerlitz, which is arguably Napoleon's finest battle, but the need for patience at the strategic, operational, and tactical level are all highlighted. Likewise, the need for decisive action when circumstances dictate must be seized. In chess, having the next move is considered the most critical component. But there exists a situation called Zugzwang, where any move taken weakens your position. It literally translates to compulsion to move. It would be the apex of military skill to place your enemy in such a condition. But I'd argue it's only within the strict confines of rule-based games that such a condition exists. Even in chess, you usually only find it in the endgame, where few pieces remain. The more variables that exist, the more options that each side has. And while you may think you are in a Zugzwang, or you have placed your enemy in such a condition, what you have done is forced an unpredicted move to break out, one which you aren't prepared for. Arguably, the Arab-Israeli battles of 1956 and 1967 were examples of an assumed Zugzwang that wasn't. The need for patience is perhaps most pronounced at the strategic level. The Arab-Israeli conflicts show how this affects both sides and in different ways. The primary fact of this 80-year-old conflict is there are a lot of Arabs and not many Jews. The Israeli Defense Force, or IDF, relies upon a mandatory draft and the use of nearly all the men in the country as part of their reserve forces. Israel cannot fight a conflict of any size without drawing upon its reserves, which means depleting its workforce for the duration of the war. This fact was used by Gamal Nasser in 1956 as well as 1967. The Egyptians and their Syrian allies have a far larger population from which to draw their armies, and their standing army dwarfs the full-time force of the IDF. So in both of these conflicts, Nasser massed an enemy force in the Sinai while verbally vowing to destroy Israel. Israel could not ignore the threat, and in both instances mobilized the bulk of their reserves. Israel's economy ground to a halt. Nasser could maintain this status quo indefinitely. Arguably, he intended to. Israel had three options. Ignore the threat and maintain a weak defense in the Negev desert was option one. However, due to the geography, it would take but a few hours for the Egyptian armored forces to reach Tel Aviv, should they punch through the paltry lines. Israel's borders in 67 and 56 allowed no strategic depth. In effect, they wouldn't have any defense at all. This course of action, to do nothing, was unacceptable. Option two was to mobilize and maintain a strong defense while relying upon international support to break the Egyptian stranglehold on the Straits of Tiran, which led to the port of Eilat, and force Nasser to remove his forces from the Sinai. This course of action was tried in 1967 and failed. The UN, in fact, withdrew their peacekeeping forces at the request of Nasser, and the U.S. refused to break the Egyptian hold at Sharm el-Sheikh, guarding the entrance to the Gulf of Aqaba, leading to Eilat. Israel's economy simply could not withstand a prolonged mobilization of Israeli forces. Option 3 was to attack the massed Arab armies. In both 56 and 67, this was the course of action selected by Israel after Option 2 was tried and failed. Nasser trusted to the strength of the defense and assumed this course of action was a loser for the Israelis, whereas Israel trusted to B.H. Liddell hard and Duhay and struck decisively and rapidly on air and ground defeating the Egyptian forces in a mere 100 hours in 1956 and in only 6 days in 1967. This strategic aggressiveness was born of necessity due to the condensed Israeli borders. In the case of Nasser, had he effectively maintained the status quo antebellum, he could have bankrupted the Israeli economy and could have maintained his forces afield almost indefinitely. Israel knew this and was forced to action. The high operational and tactical tempo of the IDF was forced by the strategic patience of the Arab forces. Nasser had a sound strategy, but a weak military. But these victories led to diplomatic pressure which, as we discussed earlier, forced Israel to accept the first blow in 1973. But, in the case of the Yom Kippur War, known as the Ramadan War in the Arab world, Israel occupied the Sinai, which gave them the strategic depth they lacked in 56 and 67 to accept the blow and then mobilize their reserves. The type of military a country possesses can dictate the nature in which they conduct operations. The levée en masse, where you mobilize a sizable proportion of the men, has the advantage of maximizing mass, but at the cost to your economy, which, in a prolonged war, can prove a bigger threat politically than accepting the political objectives of your enemy. A full-time professional force gives you time and, in theory, superior capability, but is, by necessity, far smaller than what a mass mobilization would give you. The global war on terror could go on for 20 years simply because the all-volunteer professional force was sustainable by the American economy, as well as the various groups they fought. World War II was a far shorter war, but with a far worse death toll, because all the nations had effectively shut down civilian and peacetime activities in support of the war. Which one is better or worse is irrelevant, but the desire for quick and decisive actions, a high tempo at the strategic and operational level, will partially be dictated by the type of forces with which you fight and those with which your enemy fights. Returning to my own experience in Afghanistan, I admit my own bias to action. I sought aggressiveness in my subordinate commanders. Better the reins than the spurs, I thought. More than once, however, my aggression led me from a position of advantage to one of disadvantage in only minutes. Calculated risk shifted to foolish gambling, and my admitted success in combat led to a change in tactics from my enemy, which necessitated a frustrating pause to offensive action I had only months previously disdained as cowardly. Not least of which was the growing realization that, for any of my tactical success, I couldn't see the strategic benefit. I suspected I was merely adding to Sun Tzu's noise before defeat. My aggressive subordinates expressed their frustration as I limited the action to which they had grown accustomed. But I lacked the mobility and intelligence required for decisive tactical actions, and the enemy was refusing to engage in direct fights and relying on IEDs, which proved their most effective weapon, and their use the Taliban's most effective tactic. In retrospect, the war now a historical footnote of American failure, I treasure the mature knowledge that no one died unnecessarily due to my tactical patience. War means fighting, and fighting means killing, and at times dying. A large part of my reasoning behind this podcast is to explain the uncertain nature of conflict to those who have never experienced it. For every advantage, there's a disadvantage. There are no hard rules, only guidelines that must be adjusted to the situation. And that is why, in the end, war will ultimately be a tragic art and never a precise nor pristine science. Next week, we will discuss the macabre consequences of a blind adherence to this desire for action, a request from one of my subscribers, as we recall the forgotten tale of the Hurtgen Forest. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.